Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, Last time we pretty much got through chapter 2, but we had left it at looking at the business cycle. And at that time, I was talking about how the government would try to respond to different parts of the business cycle and try to, get us through this trough into recovery. Obviously, sort of manage inflation as we get to the peak. Remember, inflation measured by consumer price index. We also had the producer price index, different ways of measuring inflation, and try to avoid as much as possible, or at least lessen the impact of recession, so that over time we would see this growth trend that you see being recognized over a period of I guess several cycles in the economy, I guess is what's represented here. So we're going to start to talk about fiscal policy for the government. We're going to talk about monetary policy. And these are the two key measures that or methods, I should say, that they use to, help control this process of the economy as much as possible. Um, After that, we'll get into chapter 3, and we'll start to pick up our discussion of ethics for chapter 3, and we should be able to get through all that, including, and might be a little confusion. There's two files that I'm giving you for your quizzes. One is a Word file that contains all of the quiz questions, but also I've embedded them throughout the chapter as well. So most of the questions that are in the quiz are also in these slides, and we'll go through those together. And again, making sure that you're getting the points for the quizzes, and for the quizzes is predicated on making sure that you're here, you're present, you're participating, etc. Right? Okay. So that's where we're going with this. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the two ways that the government will try to, we say, control the economy. It's probably more like I don't know if you could ever control it, but it's sort of like trying to, when I say regulate it, I don't mean from a regulation policy of laws, etc., but regulate in terms of the speed of the economy, the growth of it, etc. Okay, so there's two policies. One is called fiscal policy. The other we'll see is monetary policy. Now, when we talk about fiscal policy tends to have two components. One is taxes, okay? And the belief is that if the government cuts taxes, that's going to put more money into the system that will help grow the economy. If the government wants to slow down the economy, it could raise taxes, doing what? Taking certain funds out of the system, and that could potentially slow down the economy if that was indeed the desire, because perhaps we're too much into that expansion phase and we're starting to get into some potential for inflation. Now, it's sort of a double-edged sword, in that one can look and say, well, the government should cut taxes and that'll spark the economy. By the same token, if the government cuts taxes, then it does not have as much funds available for various programs, etc. They could put cash into the system. So this becomes a double-edged sword. When we had the 2008 financial crisis, one of the things that the government did, and it's the other side of fiscal policy, is increase government spending. Okay, and so what President Obama did when he came in, there was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, in which they provided funding to banks and different programs for banks. Really what they did was they improved what they call securitization markets. What was happening is banks were no longer willing to buy mortgage-backed securities because there were so many problems with some of the mortgages. And if banks don't buy mortgage-backed securities, then entities are not going to offer home loans. If you don't have home loans, that was causing some of the depression in the housing market. You have depression in the housing market, that can cause depression in the overall economy. So what the government did as part of the Troubled Asset Relief Program is they stood up and they said, we will back any mortgage-backed securities that a investor buys. So if the investor buys it and later on that security becomes worthless, the government would guarantee the value of that security. And so that kept the securitization markets open, and that was a big part of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Another part of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, well, there are a few pieces. One was buying GM stock. Okay, so there was an infusion of capital into GM because the federal government bought their stock. That kept them afloat. And then another major part of the whole program was was different, was the stimulation package. Okay, and what they did was they spent money and provided funding to various various shovel-ready projects. For example, if a road was needing to be improved and that project was ready to go, they just needed the funding to get it going. They went ahead and provided funding for that, additional funding for that the federal government did, so these shovel-ready projects could get going and individuals could be put back to work through these various shovel-ready programs. Okay, so this is an example of fiscal policy of the other side, not the tax side, but the government spending side, where the government spends money to start to stimulate the economy, help people to get to work, find jobs, and that will put us more into that recovery expansion phase. There was a fair amount of criticism about that it didn't really create jobs, but if you look over time, since they put that program in place, there has been growth in jobs and growth in the economy, although not as quick as some individuals would hope that it would be. So remember, we talked about GDP last time and how that's grown. So these are the two policies. One is through taxes, one is through government spending, and they kind of compete against each other. You cut taxes, more cash in the system, but then how do you have the money to finance the fiscal side where the government can spend money to help stimulate the economy? So we tend to go back and forth on that, and that's a lot of what the arguments are about in Washington, right? One side says, well, you have to cut the taxes to keep the economy going. Other side says, well, no, we have to raise taxes so we can have the appropriate government spending to stimulate the economy, and they tend to go back and forth on those issues. Okay, so that's fiscal policy. All right, now we also have what we call monetary policy. Okay, and with monetary policy, we really look to the Federal Reserve Board to help us to determine what the fiscal policy is going to be. The chair right now is Janet Yellen. Before Janet Yellen, it was Greenspan, I think, was the one before. There may have been another one before, after Greenspan, but before Janet Yellen. But the current is Janet Yellen, and this board basically determines the fiscal policy for the United States through the Federal Reserve System. And I talked last time, I think, that Alexander Hamilton's the one that sort of came up with this whole Federal Reserve banking system. And they wield quite a bit of power with some of the decisions that they make, some of the policies that they implement that helps determine how the economy is going to be affected by monetary policy. They are really not part of the federal government. Even though Janet Yellen, the chair, is appointed by the president, they are not a federal agency. They are really funded. They're a quasi-federal agency. They're really funded privately through banks. Banks have to pay a certain percentage of fee, essentially, and that fee helps run the Federal Reserve banks. And so I've spent a little bit of time with these guys, both, not these individuals, but with the Federal Reserve banks, both in San Francisco and New York. I've been to the Chicago Fed as well. There's 12 of them across the country, and we were doing work looking at how they were helping provide fiscal service to the federal government for the auction and issue of public debt. And they live pretty nice. I mean, they have like subsidized lunchroom for their employees and stuff, and you can get like a prime rib for $1.99 for lunch and stuff like that. And part of it is because they get fee from the banks. The banks have to pay. If you want to be a bank, you want to open a bank, you have to pay to play to be involved and be regulated by the Federal Reserve banks, etc. So that's a little bit about how they work. But as I mentioned, there's 12 Federal Reserve banks across the country, and you see that they break them into regions. Boston was the first. I'm not sure how Boston ended up one. New York, two, because I believe at that time Bank of New York was key as part of that process, but somehow New York ended up two here. But you can see how over time the regions expanded westward, and the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco was the last one that was added that covers a good chunk of the west coast up through, that's all the way through the Rocky Mountains there, I think, right? Like I said, I've been in Chicago and in New York and San Francisco. New York is probably the nicest ones. They're on 33 Liberty Street, and it's a pretty nice building that they're in and stuff. But all of them are pretty good digs that they have. Okay. Now, what happens? They have this group called the Federal Open Market Committee, and this is the committee that ends up setting the fiscal policy that we're going to talk about. In the fiscal policy, they have three primary ways that they will stimulate or affect fiscal policy, better way to put it. One is through the reserve requirements that they have with the banks. The second is going to be by the interest rates that they charge banks to borrow money from the Fed. And the third and most common way that they use is through their purchase in the system open market, through their purchase of Treasury securities. Okay, and we're going to just look at those three right now. Okay, so they have these three different ways of affecting the money supply now that I just mentioned. But when we talk about money supply, there are different measures of money supply: M1, M2, and M3. Okay, M1 is basically money that is readily spendable in terms of cash, amounts that are in checking accounts, traveler's checks. These are pretty much amounts that people are walking around with that are readily spendable in their funds. And you say, well, what about credit cards? Well, we would consider that to be money that is considered currency, right? Because you can pretty much spend that like currency. Okay, so we have M1. Then we take M1 and we consider M2, and we take M1 and we add in money that is in savings accounts, money markets accounts, and certificate of deposit that are less than 100,000. And so these are fairly liquid funds as well, but the idea is that if you're sitting there and you're putting money in a savings account, you're probably thinking you're going to hang on to that a little bit longer. But of course, it doesn't take a whole lot of difference for you to change your mind and decide to pull that money out of your savings account and spend it. So we put it in a different category, or we add it on to M1 to give us a different measure, M2. Okay, and this is how readily this money is available to spend, right? M1, cash, obviously you can spend, checking accounts, you got checks sitting there, you got your debit cards that you can use. M2, we add money that you may have in your savings account. Again, the idea that you're probably going to hang on to that a little bit longer, and you could have a certificate of deposit, which usually has a period of time that you need to hold that money before you can cash that in. Usually it's like 30 days or something like that. Now when we get to M3, we add funds that are not quite as liquid as these others. For example, a treasury bill. Okay, if you put money into a treasury bill, usually that treasury bill will have a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day period associated with it, but you could trade that readily on an open market if you needed to and cash that in early. A treasury bill is backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government, and because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government, pretty much anyone is willing to trade that almost as though it were cash, right? Although you'd have to cash it in first, but it's not like you would have trouble having someone take your treasury bill. This is why when they start talking about this situation of the government defaulting on its debt each year. Remember, we're going to have this public debt project. Not each year, but frequently at certain periods of time as spending increases, the government will get close up to something they call the debt ceiling. Okay? Did I talk about the debt ceiling in here? Debt ceiling is where it's a law that was passed where the government will cap its spending. And they'll cap their spending, say, at $19 trillion, right? Okay, so if we cap our spending at 19 trillion, go ahead and get my pen going here. 19 trillion, how many zeros is that? Not cap our spending, but cap our debt. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Do I have enough? Do I need 3 more? Just 3 more. Okay, good. 10, 11, 12, $19 trillion, right? And they'll set that as the debt ceiling, let's say, meaning that the debt should not go over that amount, right? Is that our debt ceiling? Okay. Should not go over that amount. Now, what happens? They go ahead and let's say that the debt is 17 trillion. I guess I like to draw zeros. Like to write zeros. So let's say the debt is 17 trillion, right? And then they pass their spending bills. The spending bills are called appropriation bill. And when they pass the spending bill, they determine that they're going to have a deficit in that spending bill of $3 trillion. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They determine that they're going to have a deficit of $3 trillion. What does a deficit mean? A deficit means that they think they're going to have tax revenue of, say, 2 trillion. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They have tax of 2 trillion, but they're going to spend. They pass the resolution to spend 5 trillion. They say they're going to spend 5 trillion. Now, why do they agree to spend $5 trillion if they only have $2 trillion of tax? Why do they agree to do that? Why do they pass a law that says we are going to spend $5 trillion even though they estimate they're only going to collect $2 trillion in taxes? Why do they do that? What if I told you only had $2 trillion of revenue? Only $2 trillion of revenue, I told you. Would you spend $2 trillion or $5 trillion? You'd spend $2 trillion. You might even have a little left over, right? You wouldn't have to spend that whole $2 trillion, huh? Okay, so what happens? Most entities would say, I got $2 trillion, I'm going to only spend $2 trillion, right? So why does the government go ahead and spend $5 trillion, let's say, even though they know that? Huh? They do this because they're afraid to turn to you and say, sorry, can't help you out with college tuition anymore. Your tuition at your college is going to triple now because the state isn't getting any more money from the federal government for this. And they're afraid to do that because if they did that to you, what would you do? You'd say, well, I'm going to vote for the guy who's telling me he is going to give me the college next time, right? And so they play this little game where they say, okay, we're not going to cut anything from you. We're going to spend $5 trillion, even though they know they can only raise, say, $2 trillion in taxes, because they don't want to upset the other people who say, don't raise my tax. Because if you raise my tax, I'm going to vote for the guy who says he's not going to raise my tax, right? And then they go ahead and they play this other game on top of that where they put up this debt ceiling to say, well, we're not going to put our debt over 19 trillion. Meanwhile, on the other hand, they go ahead and pass a what? Spending bill for 5 trillion when they're only going to take in $2 trillion of taxes. Are they going to go over the debt ceiling? If they're at 17 when they pass this? Are they going to go over the debt ceiling? Come on, guys, simple math, even though it's trillions. If I have what? If I say I can't take more debt than 17, than 19, my debt's already at 17. I can't, what? If I spend 3, now I'm at what? If I have a $3 trillion deficit, I spend more than I come in. Now I'm at 20 trillion, right? So I've already designed it so I'm going to go over this debt ceiling, right? Okay, and so what happens when I have to raise the debt ceiling? Then I come out with another set of things for you to look at as the public, and I say, this is horrible. You want to increase the debt ceiling? We have too much debt. We can't increase the debt ceiling. Meanwhile, I had already voted for this appropriation that requires me to go over the debt ceiling, okay? Guys, are we going to have to ban the cell phones in the class? Is that it? Is that what you want me to do? Okay, so what happens? You sit there and you are going to go over the debt ceiling, aren't you? Okay, and they've done that on purpose. So what they've not done they have done on purpose. They voted to do that. So they'll go through this whole little back and forth, and they will then decide to go ahead and raise the debt ceiling, and they'll raise it to, whatever the next number has to be, say maybe 23 trillion. And they'll go back and forth. And during that discussion, there it is, during that discussion, there will be some people that will say, what happens is they need to raise the debt ceiling so they can pay off maturing debt. So what will happen is people will say, it's okay, the federal government can just go ahead and default on its debt. And you'll hear that discussion too. Just don't pay the debts that are maturing, the Treasury bills, notes, and bonds that are maturing. What happens if the federal government defaults on its debt? Federal government says, we're not paying you. We're not going to pay you. You bought a Treasury bill, and it's come due, and the government says, sorry, good luck. We're a little tapped out. Does anybody have faith in the Treasury securities anymore? Nobody has faith in the Treasury securities, and when we're talking about M3, Treasury securities are what? Are a vital part of keeping that money supply going, and individuals knowing that if they have to put money somewhere for a short period of time, they can put it in these Treasury bills. You take that away as a safe place to put your money, that's going to severely affect the money supply, the economy, etc. And that not only affects the U.S. economy, that affects, and we're going to talk about international business next time, but that also affects international markets, and that many foreign countries like to put their excess short-term cash into Treasury securities because they know it's a fairly safe place that you can put that money for a short period of time. In fact, when the 2008 crisis was going on, there were individuals who were willing to bid a negative return on their investments. So what they did to make sure that they could put their money into Treasury securities, they were willing to give the Treasury money to hold their money because at least they could control their losses that way, right? Rather than putting it somewhere else and just having the bottom drop out and not being able to maintain their cash position. Okay, so we have these three things. M1 is the money that's in travelers' checks, etc., readily spendable. M2, we add on some additional items such as money in savings accounts, CDs. M3, then what? Then we go even deeper and start to talk about fairly liquid investment like Treasury securities, that sort of thing. Okay? Okay, good. So you come over and you take a look at the ways that the Federal Reserve tries to impact this money supply. And one is by changing the reserve requirements. Reserve requirements are what banks have to hold in reserve against their deposits. And there's various percentages depending on the bank. But let's say the bank collects $100 million in reserves, and they tell them that they have to maintain what? 3% of that at all times. That money has to stay in their accounts. They can't lend that money out, etc., right? So what does the Fed do? They will reduce that reserve requirement. If they reduce that reserve requirement, the banks have to hold less money in their accounts against deposit. More money is available for spending, right? Okay. Now they to be in the economy to lend out, etc. To help provide a factor. Remember our factors of production. One of them was capital. This is chapter 2's PowerPoint. Chapter 2 lecture is the actual recording of the lecture. I think it says chapter 2 PowerPoint has a PPTX extension on it, something like that. Okay, sure. Okay, so if I don't have to hold as much in reserve, I can lend the money out. We said that capital is a factor of production. That's going to impact the economy, supposedly, increase our recovery or help get us out of a trough or whatever. Okay, this is probably the least used method to affect the money supply. This is the least used method by the Fed. They rarely change the reserve requirement. Every now and then you'll hear rumors because the Fed is somewhat close to the vest about what they plan to do at any point in time. And every now and then I'll hear speculation, well, they're going to change the reserve requirements. And I'm like, I doubt that. And you never actually hear about them changing. You rarely hear about them changing the reserve requirement. But this is one method that could be used. Okay? Okay, good. And this slide, I just kind of stuck in. I went on the internet and saw what the current reserve requirements are for banks with different amounts of deposits. And when they say percent of liabilities, your money that you deposit in the bank is a liability to the bank. It's a bill to the bank. The bank conceivably would have to, in fact, not conceivably, would legally have to do what? Although they could put some time requirement on it. They'd have to provide that money back to you at your demand, wouldn't they? Okay, so you could just come up and say, hey, I want to withdraw my funds from the bank, and so they'd have to pay that back to you. So that's a liability. Now, if you give them $100, what's going to happen? Well, you can see here that depending on the size of the bank, let's just do this 3%, they will keep $3 on deposit, but they will go and lend out whatever, $7, right? Right? And if we want to increase the amount of money that they can lend out, we reduce this reserve requirement. We'll make it 2%. Now they can lend out $8 of your, now they can lend out, I said $10. $80 of your money, right? If it was a $100 deposit. Yes, sir. Are you asking me an accounting question? Don't ask me an accounting question. When you give the bank money, what journal entry will they make for the cash that they receive? Very good. They'll debit cash for $100 because you just gave them cash, right? They got to credit something, don't they? They credit liability for deposits for $100 because they owe you that money. That's your money. It's not their money. They owe it to you. That's your money, right? That's not their money. So that's a liability to them. I talk about liabilities as being bills. It's claim against your assets, right? Okay, if you have, $100 in your pocket, but you know that you have an $80 phone bill to pay your cell phone bill, then what? You don't really have $80. You only got $20, right? Because you got a bill, a liability. Well, this bank doesn't really have $100 to their name. Really, they have $0 that's theirs, right? Because that all belongs to you, right? Okay, but then what happens? Then they go ahead and the Fed allows them to lend out $70 of that. I'm assuming that would be a 30%, a 3%. So they're going to let them lend out $97. I think I was using 30% before when I was doing it in my head. They're going to let them lend out $97, but they're going to have to hold 3. Okay, so what they would do when they lend that money, they would debit loan receivable. for what? $97 in this example, and credit cash for 97. So now they've loaned out almost all of your money, haven't they? Okay, but they're still holding that $3. Then what? Let's say that they lend that money out, and just to make the numbers easy, I'm going to say that would be a very high interest rate. But let's say they charge 10% interest for this person, right? They loan the money, and the person's got to pay them back the money in 1 year plus interest. So what happens? Then when they get the money back, they're going to get what? They're going to get 97 plus what? We'll just say $10 for round number sake, guys. I know it's $9.70, but bear with me so this example doesn't get into completely weird numbers. But now they're going to get $107 back, aren't they? So when they get that money back, they'll debit cash $107. They will go ahead and they will credit what? They will credit the loan receivable for $97, right? Because they're getting that money back now, and they're going to credit revenue for $10. Now, don't worry if you haven't taken accounting, you don't quite understand all this thing I'm doing with journal entries up here, but they do now have what? More cash than they had before, don't they? They've got this $7 extra, right? And so now they could take that $7 and do what? Loan that out, get more interest, etc., right? Now, if the Fed had said that what? That the loan requirement was 2%, or there were no, you see on this slide, some of them have 0, they could have lended out that entire $100, couldn't have they? Right, if they had no reserve requirement, and if they charged 10%, now the revenue would have been what? $10. Now they have more money that, well, I rounded up, but it would have been more revenue, right? And they could have gone ahead and what? Loan more money out because they have more revenue. That presumably would do what? Take us out of that trough situation and bring us more towards a recovery, expansion, end of things. Okay? Now, this is the least frequent way that they're going to impact, because this is sort of a big deal. When you do this, you know, you can't keep going to banks and saying, okay, reserve requirement is this. Now it's that. Now it's this, because banks have to plan accordingly for those reserve requirements, right? So this is the least used method by the Fed, okay? The next used method, okay, is going to be by decreasing the discount rate, or increasing it depending on what they're trying to accomplish. If they're trying to decrease the money supply, they would increase it. If they're trying to increase the money supply, they would decrease the discount rate. The discount rate is what they charge their member banks to borrow money from them. Who are the member banks? You have the Federal Reserve Bank, have Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, right? And let's say that one of their member banks is Bank of America. Bank of America, their banker is the Fed, right? Okay? And so what happens? If you reduce the discount rate for Bank of America that they can borrow money from, conceivably, economic theory says that Bank of America will do what? Borrow more money from you at this lower interest rate. If they have more money, now they have what? More money to lend out, etc., right? So the way the Fed controls interest rates, you always hear, oh, they're going to increase the interest rate, they're going to decrease the interest rate. They're talking about the discount rate that they will charge their banks. And once they change that rate, conceivably, that should have an effect on the rate in which you can borrow money, right? So if the Fed reduces the discount rate, then the bank should reduce the interest rate that they charge you for borrowing, and that is going to stimulate the economy again, and that what? And that they more people will be willing to borrow money, to buy houses, whatever. That's going to stimulate the economy, right? Right? If I told you that you were wanting to buy a house and you're looking at a house, you want to buy $1 million house, and I tell you the interest rate is going to be 6% on that loan, you might look at that and say, okay, that's going to be pretty tough. If I tell you the interest rate is 3%, you would be surprised the impact that that has on your ability and the affordability of that house, right? And so why would the bank charge 6% instead of 3%? Because they are able to borrow money because the Fed has lowered their discount rate, right? The rate that they can borrow money at. And so that could increase, could affect the interest rates. Okay. We also have the federal funds rate. This is for overnight borrowing, not from the Fed, but between different banks. They call that the federal funds rate. Okay. All right. The most common way is in the open market operations. They don't call it this here, but this is called the open market operations. They used to call it system open market. I think they still do. When we were auditing the Federal Reserve banks, my office, the GAO, when we were looking at the public debt in that process, they would not let us even within miles, I shouldn't say miles, but it was always a closed room discussion as the System Open Market Committee made a decision as to the Treasury bills, notes, and bonds that they were going to buy. This is the most common way that they do this because every week the Fed decides how much of Treasury notes, bills, and bonds they're going to buy at any point in time. So what happens? If they buy a lot of Treasury securities in the open market, what are they doing? They're taking those securities, they're holding those securities, and they're putting what? Cash into the market, aren't they? Okay? And they do this how often? They do this weekly. So this is the most common way that they affect the money supply. I think it's either Tuesday. I think it's Tuesday they decide, and Thursday is when they buy the securities. Or is it, maybe it's Monday? I'm not sure if it's a Monday or Tuesday. I think the auction is on Tuesday. So it's Monday that they make the decision. Tuesday is the day that they actually go ahead and purchase the securities, and then on Thursday the securities get auctioned, and then on Thursday they actually get issued. But every week they come in and they make a decision as to what they're going to buy in this system open market. And so that is the most common, most frequent process that they do every week, and that then helps them to regulate the economy, either stimulating it. If they buy more Treasury securities, if they buy fewer Treasury securities, that's going to what? That's going to tend to want to cool off the economy. Okay? Okay, so three methods. What? The reserve requirement, which is the least common, the requirement for the discount rates, right? And then the third is these buying and selling of Treasury securities, and this is the most common. Question? Okay, good. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this one. And the reserve requirement is defined as what? The minimum amount of money banks hold in reserve to cover their deposits, right? Okay, we saw that those are pretty low amounts, 3%, sometimes 0%, but this would be the least common way that we would try to affect the money supply. In which part of the business cycle would the Federal Reserve be most likely to increase the discount rate to discourage banks from borrowing? And the answer is what? The answer is expansion. If we're in a situation where that expansion is happening too quickly, it's going to do what? It's going to cause inflationary pressure. And so the Fed would say, you know what? We're not going to lower the interest rate. We're going to increase the interest rate because there's too much money out there, and that's going to cause inflation, right? And you've probably heard people talk about this condition when you say, oh, we were trying to buy a house, and they wanted, $1 million for the house, and we put in a bid for $1 million. We thought we were going to get the house, and 10 other bids came in, and they were offering more than the asking price. They were asking 1.2 million was what they finally sold it for. So what happened? That's inflation, isn't it? We thought the price of the house would have been $1 million, and what happened? It ended up selling for more, 1.2 million. Why? Because there was too many people with money that could drive up the price of that particular house, whatever, right? That's what happens when there's too much money in the system. It drives up the inflation. Now, you've got other factors going on there. For example, real estate people. I was going to sell my house. I didn't, but I was going to sell my house, and the real estate guy comes in and says, well, we should only ask, 800,000 for it, because if you put it $1 million, nobody will come, and blah, 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 right? And it goes on and on. So I told the guy, well, then I'm not selling it, because I'm not selling it for 800,000. I don't know what you're up to, but a lot of times, that was just my own personal thing, but a lot of times there will be a strategy to put the price low so the people will bid it up higher. So you have those factors as well. I realize that go into a situation like what I just talked about. But again, that's happening in the Bay Area, right? And it really depends, and it can vary by what? By market, etc., right? And so you can see that the Fed has a tough little balancing act that it has to do, right? We're trying to expand the economy. We don't want to expand it too quickly, because then we're going to get inflation, and inflation over time will do what? Will damage the economy, because companies are not going to be as willing to invest in property, plant, and equipment, because they're sitting there, well, we have to hold our money because inflationary pressures to get our supplies that we need to run our business, so we can't expand our, factory capacity, etc. By the same token, if you squeeze too much on the economy, now there's not enough money to stimulate the economy appropriately, and so we're sitting there and we're trying to hit the accelerator and the brakes at the same time often, and that in itself can cause problems for the economy if businesses can't make the appropriate plans because they don't know if the Fed's going to keep the rates up, keep them down, etc. So a lot of factors go into Fed policy, monetary policy. And then you have the other side of the equation, which is what? Fiscal policy, and the government needs to make decisions there. Are we going to decrease spending, increase spending? Are we going to cut taxes? Should we increase taxes? So trying to keep an economy going in the right direction is a pretty tough little job, right? Okay, any question? All right, so that's it for that chapter. Let's go ahead and jump ourselves into chapter 3, which I had the slides up for 3, but then they wanted me to close it. Okay, let's talk about ethics in business, and we're going to go fairly quickly through this. This is pretty straightforward information, but certainly something that businesses need to think about is operating ethically. And we're going to see that one of the major considerations here for business is trading off their commitment to their shareholders to maximize profit versus what? Versus their corporate social responsibility, right? And sometimes you're going to see a quote here that corporations shouldn't have any responsibility, just like buildings don't have responsibility. Well, we're going to see that that's somewhat of an old-fashioned way of looking at things. And we're going to realize that businesses do have a certain social responsibility. Okay? So let's just go ahead and take a look. And we have different sorts of ethics systems. Moral relativism, easy for me to say, relativism, basically says that, someone will decide their own ethics. okay, and they will behave ethically. Situational ethics says that individuals would decide what is the best ethical thing to do based on the situation that they're faced with at any point in time. Judeo-Christian ethics obviously leverages off of religion, right? So we have these different ethical systems that we can use to govern the way we live our lives, right? Now, you could also have unethical behavior in which somebody does the wrong thing and they know they're doing the wrong thing and they go ahead and they do it anyway, right? That's considered unethical behavior. A moral behavior is where somebody really doesn't have any sense of right or wrong, and they just go ahead and do whatever their instinct tells them they should do for their own self-interest, right? And of course we want to stay away from probably the last two people here. The others are these different ethical systems that drive some of the things that we will talk about. So when we talk about ethics, we're talking about ethics in business in this class, but it's really moral principles, rules and regulations. Sometimes the government has to step in and tell us exactly what to do, etc. Okay, so let's just go ahead and take a look here. And these are some questions that would help you to sort of see where your ethical spectrum is, your ethical compass, whatever you want to call it. What characteristics would others use to describe you? Honest, reliable, kind, self-centered, aggressive, courageous. Okay, I don't know. I mean, who sits there and says, "Oh, I'm pretty sure my friends will, consider me, or my enemies, I guess, will consider me to be self-centered," And it really kind of depends on who's looking at you and who likes you and who doesn't, to a certain extent, right? But these are ways that we might evaluate where our personal ethics are. Beliefs: nice guys finish last. Hard work always pays off. We must stand for right against wrong. Belief origins: family, religion, movies, personal experience, people you admire. Okay. Behavior. Okay. I have mostly shallow relationships because I tend to not follow through on my commitments. I mean, I guess, sometimes they say alcoholics have a moment of clarity where they sit there and they, realize something about themselves or their lives that helps them to change. So I guess this would be what they consider rock bottom if you're having that sort of a realization about yourself. I have deep, long-standing friends because I value friendships and work to take care of my friends, I mean, that's probably where most of us think about ourselves, but every now and then we might slip into, if we're having a chemical imbalance, maybe this is the first one where I'm no good and I don't help my friends, that sort of thing. But these are different ways to reflect. I thought about this and I thought, well, movies, where do we get our ethics from movies? And I thought, well, what's the number one, movie of all time? And this is a scene from The Godfather in which Don Corleone, the old guy in this picture, was played by Marlon Brando, is talking to his son Michael Corleone, and he's telling him about his life and why he made the decisions that he made in the family business and how it had so much to do with family and trying to make sure that the family was taken care of and that he didn't want to be someone that was dancing on the strings of the big shots that were trying to direct what he was doing. Michael's listening to that. You can see that's played by Al Pacino when he was much younger, obviously. But what kind of family business did they have? What was their family business? They were in the olive oil business supposedly, but they were actually cutthroat gangsters who made decisions to kill people if their interest interfered with theirs, right? And called hits on people. And there's a lot of violence in this film. Meanwhile, what happens? This is the number one film of all time. Why do people like this film, huh? I'm sorry? When I say number one, I don't know in terms of dollar grossing or something, but when people ask what is your favorite film, a lot of times The Godfather comes up high on the list. This movie was made back in, what, 1972? And you still see it on lists. Why do people like this movie so much? When meanwhile, huh? Yeah, it's a classic gangster movie, but I'm of the opinion that because they're talking about family and their loyalty to family, and it was all about family, that people, what? They don't see, they almost forgive the unethical behavior in this movie. I mean, the worst of ethics, right, of unethical behavior, murdering, almost, what we say, amoral behavior, right, committing murder for business purposes, yet people relate to this movie because of what? This other system of ethics that's going on that probably many of us hold very dear, which is what? Loyalty to family and that sort of thing, right? Okay, so I only point this out in that, again, it's one thing to talk about, well, these are the ethical rules, but then we fight with these sort of competing ideas of what is ethical behavior, what is not. I mentioned murder being the worst ethical thing you can do, unless what? Unless someone's trying to kill you, or your family member, or even if we decide that we have some sort of national ethics that get involved, we go to war and we kill, right? So, it's not like it's just this easy, okay, here's the list of ethical rules, and this is how we're going to behave accordingly, okay? Okay, so with that in mind, what if you're asked to act against your ethics? What would you do? Have you ever been asked to go against your ethics? You don't have to share a moment of personal indiscretion with me. I don't want to say, hey, I went out with my friend's spouse. I don't want to hear about that. But something that you could share. See how hard it is. I was working at a trucking company. And this is when I was going to college. And there was a guy that they hired that was, I don't know, they just didn't like him. They didn't like the way he looked. And so they wanted me to go over and tell the guy that he was fired. And I'm like, just as, short in the company as he was. I mean, I got hired the day before he did, kind of thing. Maybe it was a month before. And now they want me to go and say, oh, go tell that guy that he's fired, And I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not doing that. Well, I don't know anything about what's going on with this guy and, what your relationship was with him or how he got in here. I'm not going to go do that, right? Okay, now it's this tough thing because your bosses are saying, well, we want you to do this. And it'd be easy to think, oh, well, maybe I have some sort of authority now. If I go over and I tell this guy to get fired and that he's fired and he leaves, I do the company a favor. Maybe later on they'll help me out or something, right? Okay, so you could be asked to act against your ethics, and you pretty much want to stand by your ethics would be the obvious answer here. What if you knowingly do something wrong? You knowingly do something wrong, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for you to sort of say, well, geez, I thought it was okay for me to take the company car home. If you're told that the first time, you say, well, you can't do it anymore. And then what? Then you do it a second time. Now you're going to be in much more of a difficult position because you can't say, well, geez, I didn't know at that point, right? Okay, so that's going to obviously have bigger ramifications. And, of course, if you do something illegal, what will happen? If it's bad enough, they'll arrest you. Not all things are criminal, but it could be that they will fine you or something like that. And they say ignorance is no excuse, right, for breaking the law. So we have these different levels. Okay. This individual here worked for this Archer Daniels Midland company, ADM, and they were involved in price fixing. Price fixing is where different companies get together and they collude. Are they supposed to collude? Collusion is against the law. You're not supposed to do that. Remember, we talked about competition, right, being the way that markets are structured. In fact, different types of market structures we talked about. And remember, we said that if we head more towards a monopoly, what will happen? The government will step in and regulate. I think we talked about them breaking up AT&T, right? And talk about Standard Oil, that sort of thing, right? The reason we don't want to have a monopoly, one supplier, they can pretty much charge whatever price they want for that particular product, right? And the more in need that product is, the more, what did we say? The more inelastic the demand for that product, the more likely the government's going to step in, right? Well, if companies get together and they sit there and they agree in advance, well, we're going to set the price at this level, they are in effect creating a monopoly, aren't they? Okay, and if under that situation, that is illegal. Now, what happens? This guy decided to report the whole thing to the federal government, I think it was the Federal Trade Commission, and started recording some of the meetings where they were talking about this. So first he was involved with it, and then he backed out of it and went and cooperated with the federal government. Why did he do that? Why did he decide, I'm going to cooperate? I'm going to blow the whistle is what they call it. I don't mean too short, blow the whistle. Not that song. I mean what? I mean blow the whistle, that he was going to tell everybody what was going on, right? Okay. So why did he decide to blow the whistle?
When they eventually get caught, he won't be as much in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably part of consideration, that when we do get caught, maybe he cuts a deal in advance, right? Now, if you were in The Godfather in that movie, you'd get killed for doing something like that, right? But that's not the driving reason. I mean, that might have been part of the consideration. But the book tells us that the reason that and I say the book, your textbook tells us that the reason that he decided to blow the whistle is because his wife told him that she would divorce him if he didn't. Okay? So that was his border. That was his, okay, I'm now going to pull in my personal ethics. I don't want to, I'm not going to, no one's going to convince me that I don't love my wife, apparently. And he decided, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring this whole thing down if it means losing something that is that important, right? Okay, so again, when you look at these things, at these ethical dilemmas, okay, I think part of the lesson is not just what are you thinking right now and what are the consequences right now, but what could be the consequences that go beyond just the business situation, your own personal situation, and how is that going to impact down the road. And sometimes that's much harder for you to work your way through, right? Okay, so as I'm hearing us talk about this, I'm thinking this ethics thing is a pretty complicated little thing, isn't it? You're sitting here and you have what? You have all these different competing situations, your loyalty to your business, your loyalty to your family, your own personal ethics, the pressure to, comply with, whatever your boss, etc., is telling you. It gets a little tough to work your way through this world ethically, right? Okay, so what happens? You want to then associate yourself with a business that has a high standard of ethics so that you don't find at least that part of the pressure affecting you, like your boss or the company policies causing you to compromise your ethics. Okay, so how would you figure that out? Well, you could look to see what the company's code of ethics are, and it's a statement of the company's commitment to ethical principles. You could look at their mission statement. Their mission statement says, we are here to maximize profit for our shareholders at all costs. Then that's probably not the most ethical company, right? You're looking for something in the mission statement that says, while being a corporately, socially responsible, good neighbor to the community, that sort of thing, right? Okay. I was on an audit one time of a credit union, and there were some problems where the credit union was being rated. They were being rated at a 1 by the National Association and Credit Union Administration, the National Credit Union Administration, NCUA. They were being rated at a 1 by the NCUA, which is the best. Okay, and we look quarter after quarter, and we were reviewing them, over some time. Quarter after quarter, it was a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1, a 4. 4 is the worst. And so that obviously stood out to us. So we went to NCUA and we said we want to see the audit work papers for that because we want to try to understand how they went from a 1 to a 4. And we start looking at the minutes to the stockholders meeting, and all of a sudden we start seeing in that quarter where they went from a 1 to a 4 conversations about the case. The case has progressed to this level, but again, no details about the case. So we called NCUA in. This is my office, the GAO. We audit the auditors. We're auditing the regulators. And we say, what's the case? How come it caused them to go to a 1 to a 4? And what was happening was a employee got involved in a relationship with a member of the board of directors and then started telling the boss where to go and what's what and when they're going to do this and when they're going to do that. And I'm now running the ship here because I'm in a relationship with a member of the board of directors. So the management quit. Person just quit. The CEO or whatever it was quit. I'm not being in this situation. I quit. And when that happened, that got NCUA's attention, and that's when they dropped him down to a 4. So, and then we started hearing about this lawsuit in the notes. So we looked and we asked NCUA, well, what does the code of ethics say about this sort of relationship? I mean, surely there should have been something there so that this member of the board of directors at least knew that they weren't supposed to do this. And what? No code of ethics. They did not have a code of ethics that they could look to and point to say, well, this is what is expected of a member of board of directors, and it strictly prohibits this sort of inappropriate relationship, right? And so what happens? A code of ethics is important in that it helps individuals to guide their behavior within the company, right? So you're looking for a company and you're looking to work for someone. You might ask, well, what is the code of ethics that are used here to look to see that they have one would be great, and two, that they are putting in their code of ethics things that are important to you. Okay, good. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one, and we say in the modern workplace, what? Less distinction is made between how you conduct yourself inside and outside of the office, right? Can you think of some examples in the news where that was the case? Where someone got in trouble at work, not for what they did at work, but what they did outside of work? Happens all the time, guys. You see it almost every day nowadays. The sports situation is what I was thinking, right? Who? Bruce Miller for the 49ers. What did he do? Oh, did he? I didn't know about that one. The big one was Ray Rice, right? That was in the news quite a bit. Okay, and it wasn't what he did on the field; it was what he did off the field that got him in trouble, right? And that is becoming more and more the expectation in business. And you will see when you sign a contract, etc., it's going to say in there that your personal behavior, doing things that are detrimental to the reputation of the company, that sort of thing is the type of things that they're putting more in contracts now, so that you realize that your behavior outside of the business is also considered relevant to your job, right? Okay, good. Code of conduct gives employees on guidance as how to handle themselves in challenging ethical situations. I don't know if the example that I gave was challenging. I mean, that was just straight up dumb, right? What was going on there. But again, it's good to know what those requirements are, how to handle yourself. Okay? Which of the following would least likely be a source of a company's values? Answer here, their marketing campaign. Okay, even though they may put ethical things in their marketing campaign, that's not going to be really a source of their ethical um, values. Okay, so trying to think of a company that has a marketing campaign that has, has their ethical requirements, ethical values. The one that I'm thinking of, we could almost think, because they do this in commercials, when the auto manufacturers tell you about how safe their car is, and they tell you about what they show you all the care that they put into, and the one I'm thinking of is where the guy's putting those crash dummies into his car, but then at some point the crash dummies are like the members of his family that he's putting in there, and he thinks about it that way. Sort of bringing the ethical values of the company into the advertising, right? And companies do that a lot these days, but it's not something that's a source of the company's ethical values. And sometimes advertising will be questionable as to whether or not it's giving the correct ethical values. For example, we have zero-size models in a commercial, right? Okay, well, are we saying that people should starve themselves to look the way we want them to look in this commercial? I don't think that's the message that they're trying to get across, but someone could question the ethics of that sort of advertising, right? Okay, and so a company may actually sit there and decide, we're not going to use that sort of advertising, right? And we're going to, have different marketing campaign approach. Okay, so again, they can bring the ethics into their commercials. They could actually have commercials that really demonstrate their ethics, a marketing campaign that demonstrates a poor choice in ethics. But again, it is not the source of their ethical values. It's these other things, the code of ethics, mission statement, the owner's own behavior and priorities, and then the record of legal compliance are all things that you could look at to get a sense as to a company's ethics. Okay, so we have this corporate responsibility model, if you will, here that we're setting up as a structure, as a building. And we're going to look at some of these. I've already really talked about what marketing and consumer issues, how we market our product could be considered part of our corporate responsibility, right? Okay, not using, say, these zero-size models. Human rights and employment standards in the workplace, paying a decent wage. Of course, we have a legal requirement there that we have to pay the minimum wage. But what if we have a factory that's outside of the United States where there is no minimum wage requirement? Would it be okay for us to use child labor in a situation like that? So again, that does not just extend to within the United States. Ethical sourcing and procurement. Again, are we going to just go ahead and pollute another country's environment because they have less strict environmental requirements than the United States? Would that be appropriate, right? So we have that consideration. Environmental health safety concerns for our product. Are we going to create a product that just pollutes the air, or are we going to try to generate product maybe that runs cleanly, that is safe, etc.? And community and good neighbor policy is just showing that you are investing in the community. For example, if you are a company that's in a particular part of the country, or you're a dominant employer in a particular neighborhood, are you providing some sort of educational program that will help individuals to grow and gain education? Okay, so these are some of the things that we're going to look at. Economist Milton Friedman said asking a corporation to be responsible makes no more sense than asking a building to be. Is that true? Is that true? What is a building made of? Bricks, mortar, whatever, right? What are companies made up of? People. Companies are made up of people. The decisions that are made by companies are made by people. I mean, this is the most ridiculous thing I think I've seen in a while. Milton Friedman was an economist. He believed in monetary policy. He believed that the only way that they should try to stimulate the economy is through monetary policy. In other words, back off of what? Fiscal policy. And that if we back off of fiscal policy, what's happening? I think he's probably thinking the government just keeps the taxes low and then backs off of trying to have spending to stimulate the economy, that sort of thing, right? So you're all on your own, is basically is what he's saying. And if the government can stimulate the economy through monetary policy, that's fine. And there should be little corporate responsibility, okay? Now, what happens? When we deal with corporate responsibility, it is hard to measure. Because we have both, it interacts with the long-term responsibility of to the community or the planet, and it is difficult to balance profits of shareholders and qualify for consumers. Okay, so let's just go ahead and take a look at some of these benefits of corporate social responsibility, since Friedman didn't seem to think there was any. Positive reputation in the marketplace, strong recruitment and talent retention. So you're more likely to have, talented individuals with a strong moral compass that want to work for you. Efficiency increases when companies use materials that efficiently and minimize waste. I was on an engagement where we were looking at low-income housing programs. Did I talk about the self-help opportunity program in here? Self-help opportunity program. I didn't mention where the federal government will back a low interest rate loan to an individual, and with that low interest rate loan, what happens is I can buy a home, but the deal is that I have to work on that house myself. So I will go in and I'll help to put up the sheetrock. I'll help to put up the framing. They'll call in professionals to do the electricity and that sort of stuff. We don't, have somebody running the electrical wires through the plumbing or something and blow the whole house up, right? So we'll have professionals do that part. But then we'll have other individuals that come in and do some of the less skilled. And if I work on your house, you got to come the next weekend and work on my house. So not only are we doing what? Getting the house together, but we're also building the community, etc., right? Okay? And so when we looked at this, we were talking to some of they call them local not-for-profit organizations that help this whole process move along. So they make sure that the community is aware of the program. They actually build the homes. They manage the whole project of getting individuals to work together, etc. Then they'll, help the people get the financing, etc. And they were telling us that at first, when the federal government came in and said they had to use green building, that they had to use things that were friendly to the economy, etc., they thought, oh, this is going to be ridiculous. Here we are trying to, keep the cost of these houses down, and now we have to be using materials that are friendly to the economy. This is going to be very painful for us. And as they said, as they started to go along, what they found is some of the requirements to maintain this green standard actually brought down the cost of the homes because they weren't being as wasteful as they had been in the past. So often companies get a pleasant surprise, and you start to see it now more and more where companies are asking you to, to recycle and provide this back, etc., helping the economy. But also I think they're motivated because it's helping them with their bottom line. Okay, and then we could increase sales via product innovations, environmentally ethic conscious labeling, etc. People will start to look, hey, I'm going to buy this product because it's got the label that tells me all the stuff that's in there that goes beyond just what what the government requirements are, or they're making it healthier products. Okay, and thus consumers want to buy it. Okay, can we measure the corporate responsibility level? Social audits, rankings, Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, this Calvert Investment Company, okay, they will actually rank companies based on their perception of their corporate social responsibility, so that if you're going to invest in them, you may look at that first, okay? Self-reporting, corporate philanthropy could be another indication for us. There's something called sustainability accounting. And more what companies are putting in their annual reports is information about how they try to develop their product in a sustainable environment. In other words, they're not going to go and fish all the fish out of the ocean. They're going, if they're a tuna company, right? They're not going to use, that's a good example, a line-caught tuna. You've ever seen they talk about that? Well, that's really a sustainability issue there, and that if they use nets to catch the tuna, there's other endangered sea life, that could be affected by that, right? And so they use line caught. You can see that more in companies' financial reports now, that they actually have in their annual reports, where they have a lot of their accounting information. They'll start to talk about their sustainability and what they're doing for this. The only problem with all of these, in my opinion, guys, is there's no fixed standard. There's really nobody coming down and saying, this is how you will be judged and measured on your sustainability, on your corporate responsibility level. And so what happens? You could look to these groups, that do this sort of thing, but it's very easy for me to argue with that and say, well, the Calvert Investment Company didn't consider this, that, and the other, as opposed to what? An independent company engaged to look and see how I have done this, like we would with our financial reports and having audits on those. So, but these are different ways, and I guess Bill Gates is, I don't know what he's doing. I guess he's giving this girl some medicine or something. Okay? All right, good. Challenges, balancing the demand of social responsibility with the successful business practice. For example, making life-saving drug available to the world's poor, right? And anybody know who this guy is? This guy, how do you say his name? Martin Shkreli. He bought a company that made a certain life-saving, I think it was AIDS drug, and he immediately turned around and jacked the price up. I think it went, and they called him the most despised man in the world in this article I took, from $13.50 to $750 a pill. Okay, now his argument, if you play this video, I didn't put it in so I could play it. If you play this video, his argument is, well, the pill was undervalued. And I paid what I paid for the company, just like I would if they had any product and I thought that it was overvalued, I would increase it, right? And look what you end up getting called, the world's most despised man. When you're sitting there and from a business standpoint, you're making the right decision. From an ethical standpoint, you are way out of bounds here, aren't you? Yes, sir.
They did the same kind of thing with the EpiPens.
Yeah, that's a more recent one. Those EpiPens that if you have a allergic reaction to peanuts or something, you can. What did they change that price to?
I think it was like $600 a pen when it used to be $1.
It was $1 a pen. Now it's $600 a pen. Okay, this is a big deal, right? And this is something I've actually seen in the presidential campaign, even, right? You've got the candidates for president talking about this now, and ways to control this sort of stuff. Okay, so again, this was just a little bit more about the article. The only thing I didn't understand, purchasing the right to a 62-year-old drug used for treating AIDS, and I don't think AIDS been around for 62 years, or at least being aware of it and treating it as a disease known as AIDS. So I was a little confused just in reading that. Why would it be a 62-year-old drug to treat a disease that's been around for maybe 40 years that we've known about? I'm sure it's been around before, but by the time it was diagnosed and we knew that there were drugs that we could have to treat it, I don't know. I don't understand 62-year-old drug. Anyway, I don't know what what they mean by that. But other than that, this gives you a little bit more detail about this. Okay. All right. Now what we have: environmental, both a local and global impact, economic, product availability, price, quality, um, employee morale, advancement, our work environment, again, the values, the ethical values of the company. And they ask, how can you affect the business ethical operations, how you affect how business operates ethically, your own behavior, who you do business with. There's a company that you don't think is behaving ethically, you just don't buy their product anymore, right? I actually had a colleague who said he's not watching football anymore. And that's quite a sacrifice where I come from, that he's not going to watch football anymore because he just didn't want to sit there and cheer for people that were, beating their wives or whatever it was that was going on, beating people up, right? And so he just said, I'm not even watching football anymore. I've had it, right? So sometimes you can make a decision like that, okay? Your investments, and of course, probably more directly to your day-to-day is who you work for, right? Okay, let's take a look at a couple of these. Corporate social responsibility is mainly concerned with how a company affects the community, right? Okay. These others, there may be some impact, but when we talk about corporate responsibility, we're usually talking about the community. Okay. Which of the following is not an example of how corporate social responsibility can be consistent with profitability? Offering bonuses to employees who embellish profit and loss statements. Please, that's a violation of the law if you do that. If you embellish your profit and loss statements, we have laws for people like that. In particular, we're going to talk about Sarbanes-Oxley here in a couple seconds, which came out of financial reporting scandals, in which we now have laws over that sort of thing. So these others could be ways that we can keep our profitability consistent with our social responsibility. Okay. When a magazine refuses to accept advertising featuring size 0 models on the grounds that it could encourage eating disorders, this is an example of paying attention to which pillar of corporate responsibility, and it was what? Marketing and consumer issues, right? And I think I used that specific example right out of this question. Since goods are more widely manufactured and sold in the global marketplace, this has caused U.S. companies to face different decisions about ethical standards on tough issues such as child labor, pollution, fair wage, human rights. Okay, so we have to consider those. It's not okay to make all your products. Was it Nike was getting some heat because they were making the almost slave labor type of thing, is where they were making their product, right? Are they still doing that? They're still up to that? Okay. So how would you, as I look at your shoes real quick, how would you respond to that? Potentially. You don't have to answer from a personal standpoint. I mean, you may have some Nike product. I don't mean to.
How would respond to Nike or people?
How might you not respond to Nike directly, but how would you respond? How would you try to motivate Nike to not do that anymore?
I don't know, probably just like share stories of the people that work there and their families and what they have to see them go through and stuff like that.
Okay, and that's a very overt way of doing it. I'm thinking in more subtle ways. Just don't buy their shoes anymore, right? Okay, and say that you're going to go with another company until they stop that or invest in the community or something, right? In fact, wasn't that the whole point? You ever heard of Public Enemy? You ever heard of a rap band called Public Enemy? They had a song called "Shut 'Em Down." Okay, and the whole point of that rap tune, "Shut 'Em Down," is what? They call out, that's why I thought of them, they call out Nike specifically in that song, and they say, hey, if they're not going to invest in the community, shut them down, right? And so you can shut them down, I guess, using the words of Public Enemy, to sit there and not invest, right? In fact, I'm going rambling a little bit, but you've all heard of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned in South Africa, right, because of his fight against apartheid. And apartheid, okay. And they always show the old pictures of Nelson Mandela, and they make it seem like they threw him in jail when he was a little old man already. I mean, when they put him in jail, he was a strong, powerful advocate, right, and somebody that they feared. Is the reason they threw him in jail. Okay, but what happens? The United States really wasn't saying that much about what was going on there, and it wasn't until the corporations took the responsibility that they were going to divest in any South African businesses, any South African investments, that really put the pressure on the South African government to make the changes to what finally Nelson Mandela was released from prison and became president of South Africa. So again, corporations can if they find courage, right? If they find the courage to stand up, they can affect changes in social responsibility and through their social responsibilities. Okay. Okay, good. When a banana supplier, Chiquita, begins to improve conditions for its workers by constructing schools for employees' families, that is an example of which of the pillars of corporate social responsibility. That's going to be our ethical sourcing and procurement. Again, we're not going to go and just completely rape the environment, destroy the environment of another country because it's not our country, right? Okay. I think we're going to stop there. We're almost done with this chapter, so we will stop at the legal regulation and compliance, which sort of gets us to, if you don't do the right thing, the government will what? Make you do the right thing, right? And so we're going to talk through that, and then we'll get into our international markets discussion, chapter 4, next time as well. If you're not aware, guys, I am putting the lectures on Canvas. Okay, I'm getting them recorded. I'm getting them transcribed. I found a company that will transcribe these lectures, so you'll be able to see the transcription of the comments as well. There's just a little delay between me posting it up on Canvas and me getting the transcription file. So I'll put it up. If Google transcribes it automatically, that's great. If they don't, I found someone else that will do it. The person literally transcribes it. I found a company that offers that for community colleges. And so, but then there's going to be a little delay to when it is finally transcribed. As soon as I get the transcribed file, I'll put that up. Okay, if you need help with your notes, etc. Okay? All right, guys. We will see you next week. Have a good week.